I work for a video conversion company for film and television, digitally encoding videotapes and film reels. It's sometimes mundane, but decent work, and my company has done a few large jobs for a number of reputable television stations since aging analog format storage and preservation became a problem. On a rare occasion, I find tapes that are mislabeled or missing, and I actually have to watch the tapes to correctly label them before encoding. On even rarer occasions, I end up finding a lost or unaired episode that was pulled due to cast change, projected conflicts, or problems during filming. Today, I was going through a large collection for a major network that was relocating their storage facility. I found a corrugated plastic box that was unlabeled containing such tapes. Now, it's common to find a few unlabeled videos here and there, but this box that had fallen in between two shelves was filled with over a dozen tapes with no info other than logos. The woman working there was fairly new, and she explained that the previous archivist quit without leaving any clue or answers as to why. We loaded up the first set to transcribe, securing it to avoid damage on the drive back. And once back at our office, I started with the biggest task first, the unlabeled ones. It was at the end of the work week, and I was the last one in the office. I just wanted to get a glimpse of what this was before shutting down the station and locking up. As night dimmed the screen-lit space, I began to watch with growing confusion. I figured I'd just listen to the radio as I sped through the tape for identifiable timestamps or markers, but these tapes just started and ended without any clues as to the date or number in the series. I soon discovered that they were all completely different shows. And even more bizarre, the tapes were from different networks and even decades from the varying outdated logos and the small stickers. The first tape I pulled had the old thick font of the late 70s BBC logo. This was likely once property of PBS before ending up in that other network's archive. I inserted the tape and watched the fuzzy image take me back to childhood, watching the dated fashions and blurry image in dire need of color correction. It was a famous antiques appraisal show that you might know, and I was about to fast forward when the wrong host appeared. A man I didn't recognize appeared on camera, introducing the show in its first episode to the camera in a baritone British accent and an actor's timbre. He did an excellent job in his first evaluation of a Victorian armoire, and I realized that this was an unaired pilot. Unaired pilots exist for a number of shows, from Game of Thrones all the way back to Gilligan's Island. The producers occasionally swap out actors or change the direction of the show before broadcast. I fully turned my attention to the television, excited to see an episode of the road show that nearly nobody else on the planet had seen. And as it played, I discovered the reason it had been unaired. The episode started with a charismatic man who was most certainly not Bruce Parker, interviewing a woman about her silver tea set she believed to be quite old. The announcer analyzed it, declaring it 19th century solid silver, valued upward of $10,000 if complete, and with a brisk nod as tears of joy streamed down her face, the woman signaled it was. The host next spoke to a man whose Monet sketches were forgeries, and the host explained how and why, and what to look out for before moving on to the last part of that abbreviated pilot. A mustached man with a wide-brimmed gray hat sat at a table with some ornate mechanical wooden box. The camera zoomed in to the intricate carving of the stained wood, and the closer it got, the more detail it revealed. It was beyond beautiful. Some exposed gears and cogs appeared to be gold and had detailed, latticed designs throughout. The host seemed absolutely stumped, and I was about to suggest his lack of expertise in antiques as the reason he didn't return. But I soon learned why. The host stared intently at the machinery of the peculiar item, his brows scrunching as a look of anguish contorted his face. He looked exhausted. Those previously lively, chipper eyes sunk down as if he'd been heavily sedated. Drool seeped a glass rope from the corner of his crooked jaw as his fingertips raised up. I watched in confusion as his fingernails dug into his face, as the host began to scratch furiously at his skin. I watched with chills as he clawed into his forehead, spilling crimson streams down with chunks of flesh from his screaming skull. It was the single most horrifying thing I'd ever seen, as the host furiously stripped the skin and muscle and sinewy strands in the fervid act of complete insanity. Lips and eyelids were ripped free before he wrenched off his nose with violent downward yanking. Screams sounded from panicked people who watched as waterfalls of blood poured down his dress shirt and blazer, and the bloodied, screaming skull's teeth became longer as fingernails shredded gums in jiggling chunks that stuck to the bone of his chin and to his clothing. Strange static disrupted the signal every so often during the horror show, and soon one of the crew, the boom mic operator I think, ran to his side, attempting to help. The poor boom operator tending to the collapsed and self-mutilated man eventually stood up, shaking his head to the camera and signaling for it to cut, which it did not do. The cameraman zoomed closer to the corpse on the floor, showing dangling threads of skin peeled from the skull stripped of a face, the eyes oozing out and clearly destroyed within black sockets. The man at the table was barely visible on the side, but on his face was an unfeeling 1,000-yard stare as he looked at the camera. But that wasn't right either. He was looking at me when loud screams erupted and the tape cut to static. I sat there, clutching my elbows tight and shivering at what I'd seen, knowing it was 100% real. Those cameras used were clearly late 70s from the video feed, and these tapes had undoubtedly been in that storage house for well over a decade before I had found them lodged between shelving racks and covered in thick dust. I searched the clearly deceased host's name online, but he seemed to have been scrubbed from history. There was nobody on the internet with his name who appeared on any shows according to my research. I stared down at the other tapes marked only by network, curiosity growing, before I was jolted by the vibrating cell phone in my pocket. I answered the phone to the voice of a man that sounded labored and slow, like he'd been the victim of a severe stroke. His deep voice stated my name, the end bending up in question. "Yes? Who's this?" I asked, still on edge from the horrific imagery I'd witnessed. My neck hairs stood up in unison from his slow reply. "My name is Calvin, and you ended up with something of mine." I darted my eyes out the large window into the night sky, spotting a flash from a reflection coming from the shadows of the parking lot across the street. My heart raced as he continued. "We can't unwatch things, but the mind can be forced to forget," the voice said over a tinny clang of metal utensils tapping together, purposefully audible over the line. I looked up with rising fear to the electrical hum of the elevator, the numbers counting up in its approach to my floor. I was in my office alone after watching the disturbing images on that first tape. The elevator approached after I'd received a text informing me that I shouldn't have watched it, and I panicked, sweat accumulating on my eyebrows as I realized the elevator was approaching my floor. The threatening words slurred out by this Calvin individual resonated with the clinking of metal, as he implied he'd force my mind to forget what I'd watched. I couldn't help but think of my time in film school downtown, viewing the classic Brazil on 35mm and the metal tools used to scramble the protagonist's brain. I ejected the viewed cassette, placing it back in the white box of tapes before zipping my winter coat on and carrying the bargaining chips of unaired tapes to the restroom in the back of the office. I raced into the dim tile lavatory, slamming the chicken wire window up and tossing the plastic box down 14 feet to the adjacent roof below. I'd occasionally stared out of that window, loitering in the restroom while a film reel spun down during digitization, fantasizing about escaping work. After a few short breaths, I climbed out of the window, hanging to the cement sill and dangling my legs in the wind below before dropping down with a bone-shocking landing. I crossed the lower blacktop roof to the offices I glanced into on a few occasions when washing my hands and tried the window, finding it unlocked in what I can only describe as a holiday miracle. I walked hastily through the office of what appeared to be a telemarketer's office based on the scripts for calls and the desks near computers from the 90s. I made a mental note to come back and take my name off the goddamn list myself if I made it back safely. I proceeded out the office front doors to the hall and then into and down the repeating steps of the concrete stairwell. I dialed Mark, our receptionist, and told him someone was after some of the tapes we'd acquired. Mark informed me he'd already logged them, and it became a bit more clear how this man had found out about their discovery. Anyone looking for the digital entry of over a dozen consecutive unlabeled tapes might be watching for that info, and paranoia flooded my brain. Mark informed me he'd directed a call my way, and I began to pace in the stairwell, deliberating what to do. They knew my name and number. They must know where I live. Finally, I made my way fully down the cement stairwell to street level, held my breath, and exited the metal door to the streets. The holidays were a continued blessing as random shoppers flooded the streets with last-minute gift-wrapped boxes in the arms of straggling pedestrians. The white corrugated plastic box of tapes blended in nicely, and even helped after I'd popped in a souvenir shop to get a ribbon and bow around it. I only looked back a few times, but I saw some shady guys in dark bubble coats hovering by my office building's entrance, and quickly turned away and kept walking to the next corner where I turned, and then turned once more, reaching a bus stop. After a short bus ride downtown, I arrived at my old college campus that I won't divulge the name of. The security card was easy to talk my way past with my old school ID that was tucked in the back of my wallet, but the door to the video editing room was, of course, locked. I knocked and was about to leave when a clearly been napping at an editing station let me in with no questions asked. I headed straight to the back wall, to the gem I was hoping to still be there, the Avid Media Composer 1000, which is able to transcode VHS to digital. An internal cheer erupted as I saw that clunky station I'd spent more than a few afternoons on, and I began converting the tapes one by one, ignoring the calls from unknown numbers. Clearly Calvin. A few hours passed as I swapped tapes out one after another, transcoding like I was back at work when I should have been en route to my family. I called them and apologized as there was no way I could endanger them. I transferred the files to a thumb drive while encoding the cassettes, texting a friend I'll call R in the gaps. I'll cut the tap dancing and tell you he's a dealer, and leave it at that. I told him I was being chased and I wanted to meet, saying, same old spot, 2 hours. Bring a USB to micro USB. When he asked where, to be extra cautious. When he picked me up in a Suburban, he looked at me like I was crazy, which I truly felt. I gave him the rundown of events as he passed me the USB converter and an eighth of Kush, which I passed back along to him with 2 folded 20s. He tried to convince me that it might calm me down, but I thanked him for his time. shaking my head, and he handed me a phone. "This is a prepaid. Save your numbers on it and use this, if you aren't just geeking out," he said, wiping his nose with a smile. And I thanked him and headed back to the building, trying to make sure I wasn't being followed. Free from immediate threat, I decided to find more about the curious box of sought-after tapes, and I loaded the one noting the late 80s monochromatic Spotlight Fox logo onto the Avid. I sat down, popped in my earbuds, and played the next cassette. I immediately recognized the documentary-style show about cops following a patrol officer behind the wheel of a Crown Vic Interceptor, even without the credits or iconic reggae theme song that would have normally been added later. The young, clean-cut officer was patrolling before getting a call and responding to a domestic dispute involving a couple on their property. He approached the older couple yelling on their lawn and was able to calm them. The argument clearly about funds which they were in dire need of. The officer ended up giving them a stern talking to with just a warning. The officer then returned to his vehicle and described the beat, giving an overview about the types of calls he typically has to respond to, and I found myself with a newfound appreciation for law enforcement as his radio chirped from receiving another call. A frantic voice listed an address in between static from signal loss, creating a sense of knowing dread as I watched. The cop arrived to a set of police cars parked haphazardly in a driveway, the officers inside the ranch-style home already. The officer approached the home with the cameraman hovering over his shoulder as he knocked on the door, which swung open into a dark interior. When the aperture adjusted to the dim lighting, the officer we'd been following whimpered, "What? Oh my God," reflecting my own shock at the scene. In between flickering static interference, the image displayed a crimson shape about 7 feet tall, perhaps of clear red plastic or ruby glass, like a webbed abstract sculpture. Hard to see clearly, like it was blurry. A pinkish red mist hazed around the deep crimson shape, extending from all directions in thousands of spikes like wineberry thorns. 3 officers with drawn pistols stood frozen still surrounding the humanoid form, which had shredded bits of what appeared to be pieces of cloth dangling from dozens of tiny branches of the shape. The more I stared at the strange figure as the cameraman stepped around to film it from different angles, the more I understood the impossibility of what I was looking at. I was sure once I saw the badge and metallic shirt buttons detached from it, paused in rapid outward movement. It was the form of an exploding police officer, frozen in time with clumps of flesh, bone, and organs nestled throughout the translucent splatter that hovered in eerie silence. The other officers seemed frozen as well. It was as if the team recording the episode stumbled upon a macabre, life-size diorama. I had to rewind when I caught a glimpse of gold, and sure enough, there was a peculiar object on the coffee table near the rupturing figure's form. It appeared to be a small wooden clock of sorts, ornately carved wood and latticed gold parts weaving together, similar in style to the box from the other video. It was only in view for about half a second before the camera panned back up and filmed the officer trying to communicate with the frozen officers. When his hand reached out and touched one mustached cop on the shoulder, the scene unpaused, bursting a violent red explosion outward that tore skin from meat and meat from bone and gore-strewn chunks with a torrent of blood spraying. The camera and operator spun wildly with the sound of cracking bones and plastic over a horrific and loud popping sound as they exploded into droplets of gore by the powerful blast. Static flooded the screen and played in a snowy haze for a few minutes as I processed what I just viewed in a blend of horror and awe. My heart leapt into palpitations when a hand tapped my shoulder and I yelped. Spinning backwards, it was the chubby editor, pointing to the clock to signal the editing room was closing, and I packed up my things into the white plastic storage box.
I began to wonder if these tapes were gathered in the process of hiding the existence of those objects, or for locating them. All I knew is what I'd seen on them made me question what I knew about the world. I could only begin to imagine how priceless these items could possibly be, let alone the ramifications of their existence. I was completely exhausted and exited the editing lab before searching maps to find a cheap hotel to spend the night. I'd stopped at a few ATM machines on my way out to take the max of $200 from each just to be safe, tucking folded squares of cash into my wallet, inside coat pocket, and sock. I'd watched enough movies to be paranoid about my card usage, figuring better safe than sorry before heading to a nearby cheap hotel and paying the older gentleman at the check-in desk with cash. I made my way down the stained, carpeted hall to a shoebox of a room, locking the door and finishing saving my contacts on my new phone my old guy gave me. I looked out the window to the brick wall of the neighboring building, sending a text to my family to apologize once more and to let them know I was safe and I'd be back soon. I flopped onto the stiff mattress and soon saw myself facing a boy with a long scar on his chin and denim overalls, sitting in a plastic chair at a small gas station. One I recognized clearly, especially with the interstate sign just behind him. The boy frantically gestured me to come closer with his hands as I approached him. I then heard the drool-filled, heavy breathing behind me. I spun around to see my family bound and gagged, clearly dead in their basement, under an exposed swinging bulb. Before I woke up screaming. I sat awake in damp, scratchy hotel sheets, covered in sweat from a nightmare. I remembered the gas station where that kid in my dream had stood from my own childhood. For some reason, his face was beyond vivid, fresher in my head than any dream or recent memory. He had been beckoning me to come, as if something innate was rattled loose from my brain by simply viewing copied footage of the strange devices on those VHS tapes. In need of answers, a force pushed from within beyond curiosity alone to seek the place I'd glimpsed in vision, 2 odd hours away from my current location. I showered quickly, then called the car service and dressed, contemplated getting something to eat nearby. Before checking the area on maps, I peeked out blinds that stank of sneaked cigarettes and noticed a BMW parked with its engine billowing exhaust in the frozen air of the village. Foot traffic was heavier than I imagined with the return of students back to the apartments the holidays had vacated, and plenty of cars filled the street, but that vehicle seemed suspicious. Tinted windows on the idling car left me with a bit of unease, and when I saw a familiar man with thick brows and a bubble coat and beanie exit the vehicle, panic struck. They'd somehow found me. I thought of leaving the tapes with a note stating, "I didn't watch and do not want them. Please leave me alone." But something about the horrific power of the objects made me wonder if they would be better off away from the threatening type that was clearly after me. More importantly, the man Calvin seemed to have known I'd seen them, and that information was more pressing than just getting a hold of the tapes. I honestly began to question my sanity when I tore the bow off and dumped the cassettes onto my bed before ripping the black trash bag from the waste bin and stuffing them inside by the handful. I zipped my coat, slinging them over my shoulder like a cursed sack of presents, and called the cab once more to instruct him to meet me out back near the dumpsters. I waited in the hallway near the emergency exit until a voice brushed with a faint French accent at the hotel front desk asked about his friend, who called him to bring his medication, describing my appearance. I quickly and quietly crept outside the metal maintenance door, seeing the black car I'd called roll up beside me. Seconds after hearing a loud bang I prayed was a door slam from inside the hotel. I tried to maintain my composure, entering the arriving car, and directed him to the station. I looked back a few times and tossed my old phone out the window en route. Despite the traffic, we eventually arrived at the station. I walked quickly through the busy terminal, bought a ticket from the machine, and descended the stairs when the gate number was announced. The video files were loaded for viewing on my way to the small gas stop, chasing the ghost of a child from last night's dream. NJ transit was shockingly sparse midday, something I'd never witnessed. I boarded the train, stretching out on the cushioned seat, and I inserted earbuds, ready to gather as much as I could from the videos I'd converted. We soon were off, and I began watching the encoded tapes with morbid fascination. Tape number 3. Local news broadcast recording, 1991. A local news crew program from the West Coast talks sports, weather, and politics. Extensive coverage of Desert Storm, some local gang violence piece, possibly serving some political agenda, and then the weather. Light rainstorms and an approaching cold front, that sort of thing. The pre-recorded headline was about a tragic commercial plane crash where 293 of 294 passengers and crew on board were killed. Hearts went out to the families, and the piece was truly depressing. When the file concluded, I looked it up online, and that flight number returned no results. It was as if it had been wiped from history. The only proof I was aware of being that broadcast, and I doubt it had even been live or even aired at this point. I felt a shiver as I realized there was a sole survivor, and I had more than a notion an antique device had been involved. Tape number 4. Unknown. Mid-1980s. A Chinese man was speaking into a camera he was holding, speaking Chinese, only one repeated question being Yan Shi every so often. He pointed the camera to a wooden table at which sat an extremely unsettling automaton, a clockwork person. It seemed to be nearly the size of a human, but the camera angle and lack of reference made it unclear. The machine cocked its head upright, then shot open latticed wooden eyelids and stared into the camera with ornate golden orbs of eyes. The mouth slowly creaked open, revealing the complicated gears within. Then, the shaky camera dropped to the floor with a crash, a visible crack in the lens. The camera on the floor was pointed at the thing's ornately carved wooden feet with golden cogs of inner mechanisms. The film played as weight seemed to shift on the gear-filled feet, then the wind-up robot seemed to stand on its own accord before walking off frame. Then, the video cut to black, as if the camera was switched off before the file ended with static. Tape number 5. A popular history network. Mid-90s. The gray-haired host walked into view and discussed the exciting new feature of a car GPS and other modern navigation methods. He proceeded to speak of cartographers and compasses, guiding by the stars, and went into detail about the origin of navigation. He spoke of marine navigation using octants and sextants and their origins. Astronomy and ancient Greek machines, such as the mysterious Antikythera mechanism, were explored, and then he spoke of a famous instrument maker and astronomer, Al-Zarqali, who created and perfected astrolabe, which used the angle of the sky to determine latitude and time. The host then spoke of a rumored acquaintance, a foreigner who he took on as an assistant and student, a man who he'd cut ties with, seemingly lost to time. The show's host walked through a museum and further speculated about the foreign instrument maker who'd been cast away by Al-Zarqali for creating devices for what he then described as nefarious and against God's will.
The screen displayed a sketch on millennia-old yellow paper, brown at the seams where it had been crumpled, presumably by Al-Zarqali himself. The machines on screen were recognizable, ornate clockwork features, and the latticed style was unmistakable. I was, of course, not surprised to look up that show's host and Al-Zarqali's mentee to find him missing from history, online or otherwise. No mention of the foreign understudy or any of his devices yielded any results. Tape number 6. Medication commercial. Early 2000s. A couple were talking about asthma-related symptoms and a popular medication with an overly excited adoration. The couple spoke in their home in depth. Then a second set of shots showed them hiking on a mountain trail, white and fake smiles plastered to their faces as a narrator would normally speed read an unending list of possible side effects. I sat up in my seat, staring at the small screen, trying to make out the sun's reflection in the leaves that was shining on the forest floor the woman had stepped over. The fair-skinned woman started shaking as if having a violent seizure mid-take. She was twitching but completely upright, and the male actor came to her aid before the scene transformed into an abstract, hellish nightmare. The forest floor, strewn with fall leaves, bubbled inward, as if completely distorted by some massive pushing force that bent the ground under her feet downward. Leaves disintegrated into clouds of fine sand that twirled around the bending space in a circular manner around the quivering actress. The man slowly skidded backwards, his skin bending, stretching and then flattening onto the unseen inside wall of a sphere that was simply not there. Blood flowed from the suffering man's pancaked skin, which ripped over poking bones that began cracking, fluid swirling around the convulsing woman in the air around her as he was reduced in seconds to a crimson smear, like a planetary belt of mincing gore. The woman opened her mouth in a horrible, wide scream before the exploding yell from the camera operator distorted the audio into a horrible squeal, then cut to static. I was jolted away from the screen and into my frantic world as my station stop was loudly announced over the speaker, and the train slowed to a halt upon my arrival. The screams replayed in my mind as I exited the train into the freezing December air. The white sky cast dreary shadows on a few bundled stragglers that mulled around near the station. A dozen or so people who appeared to be homeless walked with sullen eyes down the corridor to the platforms to and from the station's exit. I passed on a few dollar bills to begging hands as I walked briskly to the queue of a single taxi. The drive was short, and soon I saw it. The gas station from my dream on a quiet street with vacant buildings with boards on the windows and doors. A few people drove or walked by, but only one man stood out to me. He stared out at me from a window inside near the counter, tilting his head up as if to signal recognition. He was a tall man in perhaps his 50s, thick eyeglasses and a broom mustache of white on his dark face peeking from a herringbone topcoat and thick gloves. I approached and recognized the wide scar on his chin from the child in my dream, beckoning me to find him at that parking lot. This man had somehow known about the gas station I had recognized from my days of daycare as a child. More impossible, he had somehow conveyed the message over 70 miles into my subconsciousness. I approached the man who came out and shook my freezing hand, asking, "Coffee?" as his gloved finger pointed to a small diner nearby. The burnt, stale coffee at least warmed my hands as I sat in the booth with the stranger who stared at my plastic bag of videotapes. He shot a glance at it before introducing himself in a hushed tone. "My name's David. Since you're here talking to me, I imagine you've been in contact with certain objects that shouldn't exist." I lifted the bag slightly and explained the entire story, realizing I was trusting a total stranger with my life, but I had to speak to someone before I went completely insane. I realized my eyes were tearing up in the relief I felt letting this paranoid fight-or-flight nightmare finally out to someone. I regained my composure and explained the tapes, the images I'd seen, and the pursuer on my heels at every turn. He nodded compassionately and began to speak. My father worked at a pawn shop in Newark in the 60s, he explained. My mother and him barely had 2 nickels to rub together, and business had been stagnant aside from a few stolen watches or pawned wedding rings. I was just a kid, watching the counter for my old man while he was in the restroom when a nervous man came in with a leather case containing something clearly stolen. I opened the satchel and saw the device with craftsmanship unlike anything we'd ever had in the shop. And I was about to touch it when my pops got out and yelled at me to step aside as he examined the machine. He continued in a quavering voice. I'm the only one that made it out of there alive. I saw what it did to their bodies. That machine that should not exist. David told of a French inventor named Ambroise Vauquelin who became obsessed with life and death, trying endless experiments to transfer consciousness to machinery, more specifically, the soul. He approached a famous instrument maker, Al-Zarqali, around 1070 AD as an understudy before learning to metalsmith and craft intricate, unique devices. While being mentored, he was cast out when exposed for performing horrific acts on stolen newborns and orphans in search of a purifying pain that would peel away earthly ties and moral binding. He sought, through horrific suffering, to strip layers away from the human mind down to expose the purified soul itself. Legend stated that in a process of somehow blending torture and alchemy, Ambrose had eventually crafted 7 machines, each more horrible and powerful than the last. Clockwork machines, born of such maddening perversion that they seemed to break the laws of nature itself. He described the devices as much as he could, and between what he'd gathered and what I'd seen, we'd come up with a list of some of the nightmarish inventions, some centuries ahead of their recorded invention. There was Vauquelin's music box, driving those who view its contents to self-mutilation and suicide. There was Vauquelin's clock, which seemed to manipulate time itself. Vauquelin's gyroscope, which seemed to create a sphere of revolving decimation. Vauquelin's compass, able to locate other artifacts, which we fear Calvin possessed. The automaton, seemingly sentient, and Vauquelin's egg, causing a protective distortion for the operator while liquefying those in its vicinity. There was one more David was sure of, but neither of us had any knowledge of it. I tried to absorb it all. The bombshell of earthly nightmares that had been uncorked for me in that thinly attended diner. For the past 40 years, this Calvin individual has been scouring the trails to track down these devices and destroying all evidence of them in the process. I thought about the hundreds of lives he'd paid to extinguish in order to tilt the playing field entirely in his favor. He has seemingly unending funds, and he's dying. His money kept him alive, but immortality is the one thing money can't buy. He's unearthed things that should have been buried beneath the deepest ocean floors on his journey to cheat death. I reached in the bag, picking up one of the tapes that didn't transcribe for some reason, a bit heavier than the others. So, what do we do with these? I asked, holding up the dud tape and shaking it. Something rattled inside of it, causing my brows to scrunch in confusion. Burn them, David said with an eerie conviction. Burn them all, as soon as you can. It was as if on cue, with the thought of smoldering tapes,
I noticed the billowing smoke of exhaust and the cold outside the window. I turned my head and dropped the coffee, spilling it across the tabletop, but I just stared at the large familiar men in bubble coats that exited the Beamer, looking around before staring up at the window, spotting me there with David. "They're here! Run!" I shouted as I jumped up, spilling glasses and silverware to the floor as I ran to the bathroom, finding it locked. I realized that I had that rattling tape in my hand and shoved it into my pants, pounding on the door and looking back at the diner entrance. I stared in horror as David stood in place, removing a revolver from his coat as the two hired men charged into the building. Firing off shots, David's face spilled out of one side, splashing a red spray as he flopped down on the table, as cueing screams erupted from the few patrons and waitstaff. I twisted the door, finally feeling it turn as a large woman glared rudely before screaming at the sight of David's corpse splayed over the booth. I rushed by her, locking myself inside, frantically climbing the toilet to reach the small window above as loud shots rang out, punching large holes through the wooden door. My leg was on fire, and it was only then I'd realized I'd been shot. Pain stormed throughout my calf, causing me to twitch and collapse as blood poured from my maimed limb. The window was too small with the frame, and I pummeled it with my fist as bullets knocked off the door handle behind me, shattering the porcelain sink. I finally slammed open the previously painted shut window and squeezed out the small gap, ripping my shirt as I fell to the ground onto a cracking rib. I was coatless, freezing and bleeding from a large bullet wound in my calf that might freeze before it stopped pumping out blood, limping without a clue of where to run. I looked back with frantic eyes, spotting the man emerging from the car with a split, scarred face and a cane. His wide-brimmed hat was unmistakable, the same from that first video I'd watched. It was Calvin himself, holding onto a gyroscopic device similar to the style of relics I'd seen in the videos. It spun in his hands as he watched me like a hunter might a downed buck. I hobbled on a crippled limb, my bleeding shot legs swelling and stiffening in intense pain. I looked back to the diner and the bubble-coat goons that exited through the front door. Calvin's slurred shouting sounded an alarm, and he pointed them in my direction as I dragged my slow, freezing body to the waterfront, knowing there was no safe place I could possibly get to before they reached me. I removed the heavier videocassette from my pants, shaking it before smashing it repeatedly onto the sidewalk as I collapsed in agony and exhaustion. Splintered plastic shattered away from the mechanism. Spring-loaded gears were revealed by the shattered case ticked as the freed device began to spin audibly. I wheezed in hoarse breaths, trying to understand the golden wood machine, realizing the holes were for fingers as I slipped them in. The gunman was nearly upon me, Beretta drawn as I squeezed the arcane contraption, shifting its shape within my palm, as the world dimmed to complete darkness. Blackness obstructed my sight in murky clouds that coated my eyeballs as if they'd been flushed with tar. Stinging pain hammered in my bones, creating a feeling like the marrow was exploding outward, and I screamed as needles dug into my skin from every direction at once. Just as the pain seemed like it had to stop, it would intensify, rendering my body a cage of unfathomable torture. I stared at the confusing images before me, only half realizing my eyes were closed. The device induced visions of an impenetrable blackness, which was broken as the face of a young child emerged from within, watching me with curiosity. The innocent face then shivered and screamed, contorting as veins and nerves were yanked forcefully from within its skin, piece by piece in a traumatic horror I couldn't help but see, even with my eyes squeezed shut. The darkness whirled away like smoke in a breeze, and my sight returned to the present danger, to the gunman's raised pistol. The man began to scream, but his mouth just quivered, spewing forth teeth that rattled onto the blacktop. His splitting skin ruptured, sending piles of tumbling offal and shattered bones skidding onto the street in my direction. Calcium and collagen from his fractured skeleton tumbled from its flopping, steaming corpse onto the cold street, as if pulled forth magnetically. Calvin, out of the car and approaching, marveled at the violence of his employee's demise. The look on his face was of envy, intrigue, and desire for the toy in another child's hand. He limped towards me with his weight pressed on his cane with wild eyes, licking his cleft, scarred lips at the destruction with a perverse hunger. His expression shifted as he realized he was next. His outstretched, gloved hand split black leather and wool in a horrific crack as his forearm snapped open at the elbow, splaying the two bones into a fork ending with a few fingers, dripping red. Every blood vessel in his eyes burst simultaneously, and they reddened like maraschino cherries as clear fluids gushed from his nose and ears. The viscous spillage wept pink, then shifted hue to a deep crimson, thickening in chunks as muscle, gray matter, and organ tissue spouted forcefully from his splitting skin as his bones were pulled forth. He shrieked a horrible sound as I crawled backwards, dragging my numb leg as his coat popped forcefully open, delivering lungs, ribs, and intestine, adding a putrid stench to the air. Calvin's expression twisted into a horrified grimace as his face bubbled outward, then split, flinging skull fragments through a stringy red pulp that was once his face. I stared at the discarded flesh and the slick piles of skin and organs that remained, my attention shifting to the mesmerizing motion of the mechanism at his side he'd activated just before his death. It was beautiful and hypnotic, twirling and dancing interwoven rings that spun in elegant revolutions of detailed gold and varnished wood. The gyroscope twirled smoothly, spinning on the vapors of Calvin's unfolded body into a red liquid ring. I felt the tug on my foot, then legs as I skidded on the gravel of the street, pulled towards the spinning mechanism. Calvin's corpse was decimated in seconds, minced and deconstructed into a puree of glistening gore that was pulling me in. I clawed frantically onto the small cracks in the street with fingernails that bent back in stinging pain as I was dragged towards death. My fingertips grinded down through skin and into muscle as I reached frantically around, finding nothing to grip onto. I screamed and tossed the flat device from my hand towards the spinning unseen sphere with a diameter of 15 feet of ribboned gore suspended midair. The street below pushed inward, warped and cracked with booming brakes, and the vacuum sucked me towards my end in an increasing pull. I screamed as my body lifted from the ground, and I flew directly into the unseen blender as visions flooded my mind. In a last-ditch effort, I hurled the device in my hands towards it, and I blacked out. A woman with green eyes and a deep scar on her cheek turned a clockwork artifact with gloved hands in an isolation glove box, studying the intricacies of the impossible invention. I saw other mechanisms being monitored in a large, sterile space, their own awareness tethered to my waking thought as my body struggled to wake. The large facility was concealed underground, beneath an old department store. Dozens of test subjects, both animal and human, were discarded as they were shredded, snapped and flayed under unseen forces to be identified, isolated, and copied. The pain on the back of my skull alerted me of a severe concussion, but I was alive. I sat in the dip in the street of spirograph paste that was once Calvin, and either one or both of his hired guns for a few minutes, trying to gather my bearings. Only one thing remained in the gore-strewn scene that was intact. It was a device. The interlocked assemblage of both Vakulin's gyroscope and the one I'd operated moments earlier, somehow alive with the memory of its tortured creation. The vague allure of immortality and the doorways to fantastical realities toyed with my intentions as I approached the merged devices. I stood on my swollen leg, hobbling in the freezing winds to the device, and picked it up from the pollock splatter of Calvin, feeling the perfect shape and angles with the numb tips of my blue and tingling fingers. I limped away towards the water, seeing faces and visions of men and women in white coats studying and taking detailed notes each time my eyes dipped closed, as if the device was communicating with the others.
I snapped back into my waking self by blaring a horn from a large truck that swerved to avoid crushing me into the intersection that I'd crossed unknowingly. I kept moving, unaware of my direction, weaving through unconsciousness in my waking trek towards the icy river as my eyelids shut. I felt the incorporeal link between the objects as my raw fingers caressed the impossible device in my frozen hands. A bearded man held a sign spelling change in the divider, staring at me as I approached the river, the light in his eyes directed towards the priceless device. I finally trudged the last few meters to the river and lifted the merged abomination of devices with shaky arms, tossing it into the freezing river with a dull splash. I woke up in a hospital room, bandaged and coughing the fluids of pneumonia, nearly launching a plastic tube out that was housed deep within my sinuses. My head stung first, then my ribs, and then my bandaged hands, and I pressed the drip I found at my side with eagerness. I was alive, and my mind raced through the events that felt more fiction than fact. I called the nurse in and got on the phone to speak with my family, sighing and tearing up after finding them well. My father had dad jokes for days as usual and mentioned he was a bit upset that I decided to spend my holidays with the lovely nurses of St. Francis instead of them. I laughed with a mania only one so close to death can ever laugh. My father explained he was coming in the next day to spend time with me as my leg and hands healed. The femur was nearly split by the bullet, and I needed surgery to remove bone fragments before a long healing process and physical rehab began. I talked about upcoming New Year's resolutions and asked about the nephews and nieces, and he commented something about just giving the money for their gifts next time a mugger approaches me. I asked him what he meant, and he told me to turn on TV on the channel he was watching. There on the screen was that street I'd nearly died. The man being interviewed, clearly the other gunman in his black bubble coat and beanie, describing a mugging turned shooting he'd witnessed. There was no mention of deaths, nothing out of the ordinary in the cover-up that had been perfectly executed. The people in the diner interviewed were telling an alternate version of what they'd witnessed, and I almost believed myself insane until I saw the woman acting as a waitress interviewed. I watched her and shuddered, noticing the recognizable scar deep in her cheek under those simmering green eyes.